Hello, I'm Alex Drew from Faith in Later Life. And as part of our Love My Neighbour campaign this winter, I'm talking with different people about how and why loving our neighbours matters and how it could make a difference, especially for older people. Today, I'm talking with Rachael Heffer, who's the head of mission for the Evangelical Alliance, and she is passionate about evangelism, mission, church unity, and so much more. As some of you will know, the EA were part of a six-way partnership in producing the fantastic Talking Jesus research, which was launched in 2022. And today I'm going to be asking Rachael about some of the report's findings and how they encourage us to love our neighbour. Thank you for joining me today, Rachael.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Rachael, tell us more about this Talking Jesus research. What was it trying to find out?
Well, yeah, the Talking Jesus research in the broad was generally trying to map the state of faith across the UK. As you mentioned, Alex, it was launched at the end of April 2022, but that wasn't the original Talking Jesus research. For some of our church leaders and colleagues, you might know that actually it was originally launched in 2015. And where that came from was off the back of a group of people, the Denominational Leaders Summit, who were a bunch of leaders who were heads of networks, heads of denominations, who really wanted us to sort of look at the UK and rather than just anecdotally, actually dig deeper into a credible piece of research that said, do you know what, as a church, as individuals, how are we doing? What would non-Christians say about us as Jesus followers? What would non-Christians' reflections of the church also be? But also it looked to map the perspectives and the reflections of Christian witnesses too, and see whether we feel excited, confident, and so on about being Christian witnesses ourselves. So the original Talking Jesus research, which looks like this, and can be found on talkingjesus.org, basically happened in 2015. And what came out of that research done by Savannah Comres came back as so overwhelmingly positive in its reflections that those leaders didn't actually believe it. So the three-way partnership at the time, the Evangelical Alliance, Hope, and the Church of England threw a bit more money into the pot to delve a little bit deeper. But what they found was actually those reflections were true. What had come out across the UK were these really overridingly, yes, it brought some challenge, but really encouraging statistics. So just giving you that little snapshot of the backdrop, the hope was always that actually 5 years on, we would redo the research and remap the state of faith. But of course, 2015 had 5, 2020, in comes a global pandemic. So we paused at that point. But as you said, what happened was as these conversations bubbled up and what is now a six-way partnership with the EA, with Hope Together, Kingsgate, CV or Christian Vision Global, Louis Palau Association, and Alpha, our friends there, all of us came together to basically say, let's go again and see if there was a shift during COVID and what it looks like for us now in terms of the state of faith, state of evangelism. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea as to where it came from.
Yeah, so it sounds like a massive piece of research, and we definitely want to know what you found out and what difference it will make to the way we go forward in our mission and evangelism in our communities. So what were the most encouraging things that you discovered in the Talking Jesus research?
Well, what we wanted to do was, by way of comparison as well, was to go back to Savannah Comres, and worth saying that this was a big piece of research done amongst 4,000 people across the UK. So a credible piece of research that, as I asked them, can I say the UK thinks ... And we were reassured that we can. So in terms of some of the most encouraging things, well, one of those was that we found through the research that actually 20%, 1 in 5 people across the UK, when asked, and this was non-Christians, when asked what their belief about God was, 20% of people said that they do believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Even that is quite an astounding statistic, isn't it? But even more so, I mentioned that we launched just after Easter in the spring of 2022. We also found that actually 45% of people across the UK said that they believe in the resurrection. 16% of those said absolutely word for word as the Bible recounts it. 29% said maybe not exactly word for word, but again, they did believe in the resurrection, as opposed to 41% of the UK who said that they didn't. So again, Alex, just shows, doesn't it, that, these life-giving conversations that come out of those nuggets of discipleship. If they believe in the resurrection, what did they know or believe about the rest of God's big story? Again, these things can fuel our conversations. One of the stats that I'll share with you that I love the most is this. It told us, again, through the research, that where we ask non-Christians, if you know a practicing Christian and you've had a conversation with them, would you be ready and eager and willing to go again? And what we found was that 1 in 3 non-Christians said that they would be really willing to go deeper into a conversation to find out more about this. Now, that in itself is astounding, isn't it? If you go out during your week or at the weekend and you're in a coffee shop, or you have friends for dinner, or you're in the pub or in the gym, to think of 3 people around you, at least 1 in 3 of those being open to a conversation about Jesus, is quite astounding. And lastly on that, all I'd share is that, again, by way of comparing, contrasting with the 2015 research, what that statistic told us 7 years ago was that it was actually 1 in 5. It's now 1 in 3. So it shows us that there has been a shift, this sense of openness to the gospel, as we see around us now, 23 going into 2024, that actually people are really open and willing and wanting to explore what has this perma crisis been about, COVID, cost of living, and there's a real sense of openness. So there's loads of encouragement. I could share more with you. Those would be my 3.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rachel. That's fascinating, because some of our not yet believing friends would have us think that nobody's interested in anything, and that nobody goes to church and nobody cares about faith or Jesus or any of those things. So your research shows that that's not the case, and that should give us confidence to get out there. Well, as you know, Faith in Later Life, we're encouraging people to love their neighbours this winter. What do you think is the potential of neighbourly relationships? Is there anything in there for us in terms of reaching people with the good news and the love of Jesus?
Oh, there's not just a simple nugget, is there? I think it's absolutely critical and key. And if I was to strip all of the research down, of which there's so many different encouraging and challenging nuggets, which again, people, your church champions could look into at talkingjesus.org. But I would strip it down to say that the overriding thing that comes out of this research is that people crave relationships, and that in terms of seeing lives transformed, that relationships are key. The research tells us that 53% of the UK population say that they do know a practicing Christian. There's a slight alert around this, that's good news. It's not where we'd want it to be, but the alert is that since the original research, that's actually dropped. It was 68%, it's now 53%. So what that should encourage us is that actually, as Christians, as people who want our friends, our family members to come to know Jesus, we really need to make ourselves known in the first instance. Thinking about neighbours, people around us in close proximity, what was really interesting, again, out of the research, was that it told us that actually over these last number of years, those who know their neighbour, their literal neighbour, in their, in their street, in their cul-de-sac, their village, wherever they live, that number, the people that said that they knew that a practicing Christian was their literal neighbour, has doubled over the last 7 years. So it showed us that actually, despite the lockdowns and all of those things we've lived through in these last few years, actually people had grown in greater proximity and relationship with those around us. So my caution to myself is, let's not let those relationships drop as we've gone back out into the world. But I'm passionate about this sense of actually not just making ourselves known, but that relationships are key. One of the questions that we asked in the research, again, was, if you had to name the biggest question that you're asking at the moment, what is it? And the second answer, I'll leave you guessing for the first, but the second top answer was, what will make me happy? The third answer for people of all ages was, what will happen when I die? Maybe an age-old question. But the top answer was this, it was, will everything be okay? And I find that fascinating, just again, in that sense of people are asking, they're searching, and what do they need? They need people alongside them, don't they? We do, I do, I'm sure you do. We need people alongside us, when particularly I think we live in a culture where actually there is so much distrust, isn't there, of the hierarchy, the politicians, even the monarchy, right down to even sometimes our local church leaders, not for any reason apart from they don't know us always, but who do they know? They know you, they know me as their friend, as their family member. So I think there's so much opportunity that we as Christians, if we want to be intentional, if we want to genuinely build relationships but see our friends, family members, colleagues come to know Jesus, then there's a huge amount of intentionality needed, but equally just genuine friendship of doing life together.
Yeah. That's so interesting that actually the Love My Neighbour campaign is a great opportunity to build on the relationships that began to be established during the lockdowns. And I think some of us have now retreated back into older habits of rushing past to get in our car and go to work and all of those things. But the Love My Neighbour is a chance to just slow that down a bit and to reconnect with our neighbours in some similar ways, because for some of the older people, actually, the lockdowns are over, but the loneliness is still there. So, yeah, I really encourage people to take this research and go with it.
It's said, isn't it, that at the moment we live in a generation, again, across all ages, a generation that has never been as connected. And yet relationships have never been so shallow. That's come out of recent research as well. And so actually we thought that maybe lockdowns were a lonely time. Sadly, this epidemic of loneliness, again, certainly with some old people across all ages, it's an epidemic, isn't it, that we really, church and us as Christian individuals can be really paramount in combating that. So to have that discipline, that awareness, to, like you said, the to pause in the midst of our busy lives, actually that could be a challenge to all of us, couldn't it?
Yeah, really good point, Rachel. Thank you. You mentioned all ages, and of course we know everybody gets lonely. All ages experience loneliness, but you're talking Jesus research shows that the majority of practicing Christians came to faith at a younger age. Should we be disappointed, therefore, when we're working among older people and trying to reach them with the good news of Jesus? Is it what's in there for us in that research?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I'd say absolutely not. We shouldn't be disappointed. Yes, the research, as has much research in previous years as well, spoken to the fact that when we ask practicing Christians at what age did they come to faith, the vast majority of people, interestingly, say that it's age 18 and under. So it does point to ministries in our churches, our toddler groups, children's ministry, youth work, and so on, being absolutely of high importance and vital. However, I'm really excited that when we look at this research, it does point to the fact that people come to faith at all ages. When we ask again, what were those questions that people are asking? It does show us that actually people of an older age are still asking, what shall I do with the rest of my life? You know, how can I will everything be okay? Again, you know, there's questions that are there, aren't there? So people are by no means done. And also, you know, let's be honest, we look across our churches, we may have many people in our church communities who have historically come to church for a long time and certainly have a deep-rooted faith in God, but they may not have had a spiritual encounter. So for those within our churches, I'm sure much of our heart cry would be to see us, and again at any age, to go deeper in our walk with God. But for those outside the church, it absolutely shouldn't disappoint us. If anything, I think it should make us more determined that actually we recognise these elements of loneliness. We see the isolation. I myself can speak of certainly this year, again, people older and younger, the sense of pain, of trauma, of unrest, of anxiety, of worry. That again is not just young people or young adults, is it? That is prevalent in so many. And yet actually, you know, we know that we can stand on the truth of God, the Rock of Ages, who can speak to somebody in their 60s, 70s, 80s or beyond, and still the truth and light and hope of that story, and bringing our own personal stories of faith as well can be really transformative. So it's about stepping in, isn't it? Thinking positively, knowing that God can make a difference, but he can certainly use us to speak into people's lives at this time too.
Yeah, and we find it faith in later life through our church champions stories in their churches and communities. We know that people are coming to faith at any age and in much later life. People of all ages are being baptized. Even those who are really quite elderly are taking that step of faith and obedience. So yeah, there's hope for us in our ministries to older people. So when it comes to Love My Neighbour and getting to know our neighbours, it's fine. I suppose a lot of people will say, oh, it's fine, I can say good morning, or I can check if they need anything, or check in on them when the weather's really cold or really hot in the summer. But how do we move those conversations on from those general sort of daily chit chat things? How do we begin to talk Jesus with our neighbours?
It can be really tricky, can't it? Even this week in different contexts, I've had exactly that conversation with people. You know, we love them, we show you know, we show care, we show concern in all these different contexts. And yet, how do we get to that, you know, a sort of conversation? Well, first of all, I guess it's about conversation, not conversion, isn't it? We need to have faith that actually God uses the little things. He uses that just doing life together. I'm a big believer in that actually just the closer proximity shows and speaks of Jesus into people's lives. But isn't it great when we can actually have that greater intentionality of thinking, you know, Jesus, and prayerfully, maybe even in those moments when we come across somebody's path, or we go to visit them, or we gift them something, you know, that intentionality of just saying, God, use this conversation to actually speak something of your truth into their lives. The amazing thing is, again, going back to the research, is when we ask non-Christians, if you've had a conversation with a Christian, what is it that you remember or you recalled from that conversation? And what came out was the top answer was that people said, from those 4,000 people that responded, the top answer was that people remembered, first of all, that they themselves were asked about their own personal journey of life or of faith. Closely followed the second top answer, that that person who'd asked them the question went on to share something of their own faith. Now, isn't that interesting? It immediately speaks of not having a gospel moment where you've got to say it all, grab your opportunity, share the whole gospel. That to me speaks immediately of relationship, of dialogue, of a two-way dialogue, and just, again, being prayerful and intentional, maybe, of sharing something. I know what it's like, you know, even with young people. I've got 2 boys. I spend half my life on the side of a football pitch. But actually, where we enter into conversation about the weather, about holidays, it might be about grandchildren, about family times together, you know, that actually people are really open, you know, when it comes to anxiety or grief or worry. Therein, there is great opportunity to just link in that nugget of something about prayer or God's faithfulness or answers to prayer. And then back to whatever you were talking about, you know, the grandchildren. And people, I think my encouragement to myself and to others would be, why don't we ask ourselves a bit more often, what's the worst that could happen? They can either ignore us, they could walk away, but there's a high percentage chance that they won't, that they would listen, that they might simmer on it at a later date, because they like that sense of dialogue. What I love about that, again, that same question in the research, was that came out slightly lower percentage than the story sharing, but it told us that a number of people, I think it was 6% of in our research in that question, said that even in that conversation, they were aware that they had a spiritual encounter. Isn't that interesting? You know, whether it was because of us or despite of us, actually God is powerfully at work. The 2 other things I quickly drop in just to encourage us, that when we ask people, what would your reflections of the Christian that you know be? We all too often think it's going to be really negative, don't we? The media certainly portrays us as such. But actually, it's worth us remembering that even in those conversations, the research tells us that if they know us and they know we're a practicing Christian, they actually really like us. They think, the top answers were good humoured, we're generous, we're kind, and we're friendly. So we need to remember that actually we're not entering into a backdrop where people don't like us. They genuinely do. And lastly, I think I'd come back to that stat that I mentioned earlier, that 1 in 3 people are really open to conversations. So I think, to your question, you know, we sometimes perceive that it's going to be a closed book, a closed door, whereas actually, I think, particularly in this current context, as we mentioned earlier, there is so much pain and questioning, people seeking purpose and light. And actually, for us, just being that little bit bolder, little bit braver, ridding ourselves of the baggage that we might put on ourselves as Christians, but actually to just gently and genuinely enter into life and conversation and relationship with people. And it can be truly powerful, can't it? And we will be surprised to see lives transformed through Love Our Neighbour, through engaging with people on the doorstep, in our homes, in the pub, wherever it may be. And people of all ages will come to faith, because we know that God is at work and he is almighty powerfully there, isn't he? So we just need to do our bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what this research does is it really should give us that confidence and boldness to go and have those, say, 3 conversations. Because if, as you say, if 1 in 3 people are interested, what would it look like this, you know, in the coming days for us to just try 3 new conversations being prayerful about those before, after, and during, and just seeing what God does with that. I think that's really exciting. Well, it's been a delight talking with you today, Rachel. Thank you so much for taking the time to help us explore this Talking Jesus research and reflect on how it might give us that boldness to go and talk with our neighbours this winter. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me with you.
Rachel, you've mentioned a couple of websites during our conversation. Would you just mind saying those again for anybody who's ready to write them down? How can people find out more about the Talking Jesus research, and how can people find out more about the Evangelical Alliance and the work it does?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yes, absolutely. What I've been able to share with you this morning is just a snapshot of what is a much bigger but really accessible piece of research. So if you're interested to look a bit deeper into any of that, can I encourage you to go to talkingjesus.org. There you'll find both the report and lots of other nuggets and headlines from the statistics and the research, but also we've created a toolkit of resources to really support and equip the local church, whether that's looking at the research in small group context. There's an evangelism health check. There's a whole podcast where we've picked out 10 of the big hitter stats, and we've recruited some brilliant UK speakers to come and speak to us about their perceptions and their findings. So there's loads on talkingjesus.org. Would love you to delve into that. And as you said, yeah, I love working with Evangelical Alliance. We are online at eauk.org. If we can in any way cheer you on and champion you as a local church community, then there's lots of different avenues through our work in mission, in evangelism, in advocacy, communications, and so on. Please do get in touch. So that is eauk.org. But yes, thank you, Alex.
And thank you, Rachel. That's really good. And I'm sure there'll be lots of people going off now to dig a bit deeper into that research and into the work that you do. Well, if you want to find out more about our Love My Neighbour campaign, and you want to join in and use some of this research and this new confidence to go and love your neighbours this winter, have a look on our website at faithinlaterlife.org, or get in touch with us if you're looking for some new inspiration to help you do that this winter. Thank you ever so much for joining us. Have a great day.